On the afternoon of the 28th of October, 1929, while the New York Stock Exchange was losing 12.8% of its value in a single session, a 52-year-old man sat in a private office on the top floor of the Heckscher building on Fifth Avenue and watched his net worth rise by roughly $100 million. 11 years later, he was carrying a loaded pistol and an 8-page letter to his third wife. This is how the world's richest speculator earned his fortune, lost it, and outlived his own legend. In the summer of 1929, the United States was 4 months into what would turn out to be the final act of a great financial mania. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had tripled in 5 years. Shoeshine boys were quoting stock tips. Bellhops at the plaza were day trading Radio Corporation on margin. On Wall Street, the public conversation had stopped being whether prices would rise and become how high. For 100 years before him, the men who moved American markets had been industrialists or bankers. Daniel Drew owned a steamboat line. Jay Gould owned railroads. J.P. Morgan owned the system itself. Their fortunes were attached to companies. When they spoke in markets, they spoke with balance sheets behind them. Jesse Livermore, by Livermore, had none of that. He owned nothing. He ran nothing. He was a man with a chair, a ticker, and a ledger. By 1929, he had been trading for 37 years, starting at the age of 15 with a $5 bet at a bucket shop in Boston. He had already made and lost 2 complete fortunes. Wall Street had given him a nickname that stuck, the Boy Plunger, and he had spent the late summer of that year doing the one thing nobody else at his level of the street was doing. He was selling. He was born on the 26th of July, 1877, on a poor farm in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. At 14, he ran away from the farm with his mother's quiet permission and found work as a board boy at a Boston branch of Payne, Weber and Company for $5 a week. His job was to write the stock quotations on a chalkboard. Instead, he memorized them. In 1892, age 15, he placed a $5 wager at a Boston bucket shop on 5 shares of Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. He walked out with $3.12 in profit. That ticket is the documented origin point of the American pure speculator. A man with no company, no pool, no bank, only the tape. By his early 20s, he had been barred from most of the bucket shops in Boston for winning too often. On the 14th of September, 1900, at the age of 23, he arrived in New York to trade on the real exchanges. 7 years later, on the 24th of October, 1907, during the panic that would lend its name to a whole school of Federal Reserve history, he cleared $1 million in a single trading session. It was the first $1 million day in the career of a private speculator anywhere on earth. That afternoon, word reached Livermore from the only office in New York that mattered. J.P. Morgan's, the de facto lender of last resort in a country that did not yet have a central bank, had asked personally that he stop selling. The message was quiet. The meaning was not. Keep pressing, and you will take the market down with you. Livermore covered his shorts. He made another $3 million on the rebound. By the end of the year, his net worth was roughly $3 million, and he was not yet 30 years old. He was already in the newspapers of the day, the Boy Plunger. It was the first time an American speculator had been asked by someone in power to please slow down. It would not be the last. The next 22 years were a loop. Fortune, destruction, comeback, fortune. In 1908, acting on a tip from the commodities man, Percy Thomas, he reversed a profitable wheat position into a losing cotton position and blew up his entire capital base. It was, he would later tell Edwin Lefebvre, the last time he ever traded on another man's opinion. By 1914, he was bankrupt,
owing more than $1 million. He came back. In February 1915, a broker named Dan Williamson extended him a 500-share trading line on credit. Livermore sat in front of the tape and watched it for 6 weeks without trading. Then he bought Bethlehem Steel at 98 and sold it at 145. By 1917, he was clear of his creditors. By 1918, he had moved his operation to a private penthouse at 785th Avenue in the Heckscher building. A library reconstructed as a trading floor, a dedicated keyed elevator, a full wall quotation board, and on a retainer, a 6'6" former merchant mariner named Harry Dash, who drove the car and carried unapologetically a pistol. By 1923, he was the subject of what is, a century later, still the most read trading book in the English language. Edwin Lefebvre's Reminiscences of a Stock Operator, serialized first in the Saturday Evening Post. Livermore never confirmed the book was his biography. He also never denied it. Warren Buffett has cited it as formative. Alan Greenspan has cited it. A young hedge fund manager named Paul Tudor Jones would, in the 1980s, wear his copy down to the spine. And then, starting in the late spring of 1929, Livermore did something almost no other serious operator on the street was doing. He began to sell. His thesis, as he set it down later in How to Trade in Stocks, was structural. Every marginal buyer had already exhausted his credit. The tape he wrote in that book tells the truth before opinion catches up to it. His own line from the same 1940 volume was simpler. Markets are never wrong. Opinions often are. Over 4 weeks in September and October of 1929, he built a short book that, by the reconstruction in Tom Rubython's 2014 biography, had a notional face value of roughly $450 million. He used reportedly more than 100 different brokerage accounts to conceal the size of the position. Paper losses in the months before the crash exceeded $6 million. Every broker on Wall Street was long, he added. On Monday, the 28th of October, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed at 260.64, down 12.8% on the session, the largest single-day percentage decline in the history of the index to that point. On Tuesday the 29th, 16.4 million shares changed hands on a floor that normally saw 3 or 4. The index closed at 230.07. Livermore's second wife, Dorothy, who had no idea what he had done at the office, asked him at dinner whether they were ruined. He told her very quietly that they had just had the best day of his career. The figure, when he tallied it that week, was approximately $100 million. In the purchasing power of 2026, that is somewhere between 1.5 and 14 billion, depending on how you index. He had privately and briefly become one of the richest men alive. The trade of a lifetime was also the trade that made him famous in a way he could not control. The papers that winter labeled him the Great Bear of Wall Street. Letters arrived at the Heckscher building threatening his children and his life. He quietly expanded Harry Dash's role: chauffeur, driver, silent witness. At home, Dorothy, 22 years younger than him, a former Ziegfeld Follies dancer, was beginning a long and publicly ugly slide into alcoholism. In September of 1932, she divorced him with a settlement of $10 million, the equivalent of roughly $230 million today. In the 2 years that followed, in a market he had read with perfect precision for a single month in 1929, Livermore made one mistake after another. In 1934, he filed for bankruptcy for the third and final time. Assets of $84,000, debts of $2.5 million. The following spring, he remarried Harriet Metz Noble in a small ceremony on the 28th of March, 1933, in Geneva, Illinois. There was no honeymoon. He called her Nina. On Thanksgiving Day, 1935, at Dorothy's house in Montecito, California, his eldest son, Jesse Jr., 16 years old, drank a quart of whiskey at his mother's kitchen table. He told police later that he had done it to show her what her drinking looked like from the outside. She took a rifle down from the wall. He dared her to fire it. She did. The bullet passed through his lung and lodged in his liver. He survived. She was found still holding the weapon, repeating to the officers that her son had asked her to shoot him. Jesse Livermore Sr. in New York read about it in the papers and flew west with his younger stepson, Paul. In the spring of 1940, he published a thin, self-produced hardback called How to Trade in Stocks. It sold poorly. On Thursday, the 28th of November, after lunch alone at the Sherry Netherland Hotel on Fifth Avenue, he walked into the hotel cloakroom a few minutes before 5, sat down on a stool at the back, and placed the barrel of a .32 caliber Colt automatic behind his right ear. He fired once. He was 63. In his leather notebook on his person were 8 small handwritten pages addressed to his third wife. The lines that were copied into the police report and which have been quoted ever since read, in part, I am tired of fighting. I am a failure. Behind him, an untouchable trust, he left more than $5 million.
Almost exactly 91 years after J.P. Morgan had quietly asked him to stop selling, another conversation about a single trader's book would be held in another Manhattan building. That conversation took place in a conference room at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in September of 1998. The fund in question was called Long-Term Capital Management. The structure of the moment was identical to 1907. One position in the hands of one set of operators had grown large enough to threaten the clearing system. Morgan summoned Livermore with a message. William McDonough summoned 14 bank chief executives into a room. The names changed. The conversation recurred. This is the first structural thing the Livermore story tells us. Once a single book becomes systemically important, it stops belonging to its owner. A market is supposed to be the sum of independent actors. When it is not, someone has to pick up the telephone. The second is less flattering. The Livermore who correctly shorted 1929 was the same Livermore who had blown up his entire capital base in 1908 on a cotton trade he had not personally researched. The same nervous system that made him early also made him wrong. There is no separate edition of Jesse Livermore who had the 1929 insight without the 1934 bankruptcy. The conviction and the collapse came from the same wiring. This is the hardest lesson in the archive, and it is why every generation has to learn it again. A tape that is never wrong is being read by an operator who often is. He wrote the line himself about other people. He was also, and he must have known it, writing about himself. What did the system actually learn from his 100 million? Officially, a great deal. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, Franklin Roosevelt's answer to the crash Livermore had shorted, rebuilt American market structure from the ground up. Margin was capped. Insider trading became a federal offense. Multi-brokerage position concealment of the kind Livermore ran in 1929 became slowly unworkable. The pure speculator he invented was also, in a sense, legislated out of existence. The modern hedge fund is a corporation of him, with a risk committee attached. Unofficially, almost nothing. The pages he wrote in 1940 were still being studied by Paul Tudor Jones in 1987, the year Jones correctly shorted Black Monday and cleared roughly 200% on his year. They were reread by Stanley Druckenmiller, by Michael Burry, by every macro trader who has walked into a Greenwich office since. Livermore's pivotal point method, test small, pyramid on confirmation, cut losses fast, is the grammar of modern trend following. Every breakout trader at a Chicago prop desk this week is a descendant of a man who has been dead for 85 years. And the other half of his archive is the part nobody publishes on LinkedIn. Two of the three Legends of Markets episodes before this one, Nick Leeson in the Tower That Broke Barings, the mathematicians inside long-term capital, showed what happens when a book outgrows its owner. Livermore is the inverse shape, a man who understood his book exactly, until the day he could no longer understand himself. Here's a question the archive does not answer. Is the discipline that lets a speculator sit short for 6 months through $6 million of paper lost as the same instrument as the one that puts a pistol in his pocket 11 years later? Or are they two different wirings that happened in him to live in the same body? In the cloakroom of the Sherry Netherland on that November afternoon, there was a shorthand notebook, a leather wallet, a silver pencil, a pocket calendar, a hotel key, and, folded carefully into the inner notebook sleeve, 8 handwritten pages addressed to his third wife. The largest fortune ever assembled in American markets before the Great Depression ended in a private room with a private letter about a private failure. He had seen the largest crash of the 20th century coming. He had positioned for it with an exactness no one has matched since. He had stood briefly at the top of the Manhattan sky, and the part of him that let him do that turned out to be the part of him he could not live with. Next week on Legends of Markets, the trader who read these same pages in 1986 and used them to call the day the Dow lost 22.6% in a single session. Every market has its legends. Subscribe, and we will walk you through all of them.